welcome to Cover, our monthly author series. I'm delighted to present to you investigative reporter from the Washington Post, Craig Whitlock, whose book, The Afghanistan Papers, came out today. He has been working on this story for years. You may be familiar with the Washington Post's Afghanistan Papers publication in December 2019, on which a lot of the book is based, but he's done still more investigative reporting. Craig has covered the global war on terrorism for the Post since 2001 as a foreign correspondent, Pentagon reporter, and national security specialist. In 2019, as I mentioned, his coverage of the war in Afghanistan won the George Polk Award for military reporting, the Scripps Howard Award for investigative reporting, the Investigative Reporters and Editors Freedom of Information Award, and the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for international reporting. He has covered news from more than 60 countries and is a three-time Pulitzer Prize finalist. He lives in the DC area. Craig, welcome to you. Welcome to Cover, and thanks to our audience nationwide for joining this conversation.
Thanks very much for having me. Really appreciate the chance to talk with folks.
Craig, the numbers are staggering. A 20-year war, America's longest, close to $2 trillion spent either on rebuilding or fighting or defense contracting in Afghanistan. More than 2,400 US soldiers dead, 1,144 Allied troops killed, 20,600 or so American troops wounded, 66,000 Afghani troops killed, 48,000 Afghani civilians, 75,000 Afghanis wounded, and that is probably underestimated numbers. All of this adds up to a slow losing of the war that Americans once overwhelmingly supported. I'd like to begin today's conversation with you, asking you to assess, just as we've withdrawn the last soldier and diplomat yesterday, assess President Biden's decision.
Well, it was a tough decision. You know, as the cliche goes, it's a lot easier to start a war than it is to end one, particularly when you're on the losing side. And I think, frankly, Biden's predecessors knew this was going to be a tough moment. There wasn't a whole lot of faith that the Afghan government and the Afghan army would be able to hold up against the Taliban. You know, people will recall that President Obama had promised to end the war and pull out all US troops by the end of his second term in 2016. But he couldn't get that done, and he had to go back on his word and keep US troops here, primarily because they were worried the Afghan security forces couldn't stand up against the Taliban. President Trump also promised to end the war, and he sent extra troops there, brought some back, but he couldn't quite bring himself to end it completely either. But then when Biden came in office back in April, he made the decision that he was going to withdraw all troops by September 11th. And it ended up being, they did it a little sooner yesterday, but as we've seen in the last few weeks, the process of actually ending the conflict, pulling out all US troops, pulling out the US embassy and all these American citizens and Afghans who had helped the United States over the years, turned out to be way more complicated and dangerous than I think the Biden administration had planned for. You know, we of course had this, terrible suicide bombing several days ago that killed 13 US troops. A number of Afghans have been killed trying to get, both in that explosion, in US airstrikes, and trying to get to the airport to be evacuated. So it's been a very rough several days. But at the same time, in my estimation, I'm sort of relieved that it wasn't worse, because US troops there were at the airport. They were just in a really dangerous situation. You had the Taliban fighters all over Kabul. You had Islamic State planning suicide bombings. I mean, it could have been open warfare in Kabul. Unfortunately, we avoided that. So while things, it was a really chaotic withdrawal, in some ways, the Biden administration is fortunate there wasn't more loss of life.
Yes, and I want to remind that our viewers, our attendees can use the chat box or the Q&A function to submit your questions. We already have dozens, by the way, that were emailed in advance. A number of them concerned just what's going on these last couple of weeks with the evacuation, Craig. And as you mentioned, the chaos of the early effort, the suicide attack, the US has responded in kind in some respects. And logistically, it's been impressive, however. I mean, 120,000 or more Afghanistan citizens have been evacuated. US and allied citizens and troops have, by the thousands, come home. Talk about how you look at really weighing that in the context of some of the mistakes that have been made by all the administrations before.
Well, logistically, the US military is very good at logistics, and I think it's shown its capability in recent weeks, and just the sheer number of people who was able to evacuate on very short notice from Afghanistan to be able to secure the airport, to draw down as quickly as they did. And, and last night, late at night in Kabul, the last US troops flew out again without further loss of life. And that's pretty remarkable. But, this wasn't well planned. There's no way around it. I think the Biden administration thought they had, at least months, if not longer, that the Afghan government would be able to hold off the Taliban, and that if they did have to close down the embassy or evacuate people, they would have had much more time to prepare, and they didn't. And I think the lesson from that is, we were taken aback by how quickly the Taliban was able to sweep through Afghanistan and take over all the provincial capitals and kind of waltz right into Kabul without much resistance from the Afghan army and the police forces. But I think this goes back to a problem that is a theme throughout the last 20 years, where the United States government really didn't understand Afghanistan. We just had a fundamental ignorance of the society and culture, even though we had been there for 20 years. We kept cycling people in and out for short tours of a year or less. So even though we were there for 2 decades, we never really built up any expertise or long-term experience there. We didn't have many people who spoke the languages. And when they did, we were often kind of in the bubble in Kabul dealing with our Afghan allies, and just had a pretty shallow understanding of how things work in Afghanistan. And I think that became apparent in the last few months.
I think it may be you who've coined the phrase, but rather than a 20-year war, it was a 1-year war fought 20 times. In terms of the mission creep, you've mentioned the context and the lack of understanding. When do you, this is a question from Robert Nixon, when did you see mission creep really start to take hold?
So within the first 6 months of the war in early 2002, we started to see that mission creep, simply because the original objective of the war, as people who were around back then will remember, the whole point of sending troops to Afghanistan in 2001 was to respond to the terrorist attacks on September 11th. This was originally seen as a war of self-defense, and the purpose was to go after Al-Qaeda, to kill, capture, or chase its leaders out of Afghanistan. And by March or April of 2002, the United States had really accomplished that objective. There was very little Al-Qaeda presence left in Afghanistan. But that was the whole point of why we sent troops there to begin with, and why we conducted airstrikes. But that's when the mission creep also started to set in. Then it became clear that Afghanistan was just destroyed as a country. It had suffered a terrible civil war during the 90s. It had endured the Soviet war in the 1980s. Then on top of it, the US invasion. So this was a country that was just really broken, and there was a refugee crisis. There was real fear about a famine. It had no government, in effect, that could function or serve any of its people. One interview in my book with the US official said that the Ministry of Finance for Afghanistan, finance, so this is in charge of the Afghan economy, that 80% of the bureaucrats who worked there were illiterate. So, they really needed help. And even though President Bush had promised that the United States would not get involved in a quote unquote nation building campaign in Afghanistan, he really didn't have much choice. But that's when the mission creep started to set in. Was we couldn't leave, but Bush never really articulated exactly what he was hoping to accomplish in concrete terms. And so things began to drift.
One of the things that took the US off the ball in terms of what was considered the good war was the Iraqi invasion of 2003. Militarily, what were the consequences in that diversion, if you will, or that expansion of the war on terror? And what did it mean for the Afghan government, the National Alliance and Karzai? What did that decision show them?
Well, the consequences were pretty profound. And I think to this day, we sort of forget just what a diversion that was to go to Iraq. And some of it was military, some of it was in terms of troops available and equipment and things like that. But really, it was a major distraction. It was a loss of attention. The best example of this I can give is one document we unearthed for the Afghanistan Papers book was a memo that Donald Rumsfeld, the former defense secretary, wrote a year into the war. So this is, again, 2002. And he wrote a memo to someone else at the Pentagon recalling how he had gone to the Oval Office to meet with President Bush. And he told Bush, Mr. President, General Tommy Franks and General Dan McNeill are going to be in town. Do you want to meet with them? Now, General Franks was in charge of the U.S. Central Command, which included the coming war with Iraq. And General McNeill was the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Well, Bush replied, well, yes, I definitely want to meet with General Franks so we can talk about Iraq. But who's General McNeill? And Rumsfeld responded, well, General McNeill's your commander in Afghanistan. And Bush said, oh, well, I don't need to meet with him. So to me, and I mean, I was amazed when I read this memo, and we've reproduced it on the Washington Post website, that it just really shows just what a distraction things became in Iraq. This is before the invasion of Iraq, but already Bush has shifted his full attention to Baghdad and can't even remember the name of his top general in Afghanistan. For me, that really summed things up. But you also, in other interviews that we obtained for the Afghanistan Papers book, the commander in Afghanistan later on in 2003 and 2004 was a general named David Barno. And he talked about just how difficult it was to staff up military headquarters in Kabul because the Pentagon was sending all its most accomplished officers and commanders to Iraq. And as he put it, he was really scraping the bottom of the barrel to staff headquarters in Kabul. And this was a problem that persisted for the duration of the Bush administration. It was really completely preoccupied with Iraq. And so Afghanistan was on the back burner.
There was a pessimism reflected by Richard Haas, who was advising the Bush administration on Afghanistan. And also maybe that bin Laden had melted away into Tora Bora and Pakistan. What for you was the tipping point or the turning point when American perhaps distraction or hubris or self-delusion about nation building became the beginning of misleading the public, of a sort of lying to themselves and lying to the people about what was going on?
Well, you see this time and again, but where the message being delivered to the public was the opposite of what was happening on the ground. But this really developed and reached a crescendo throughout the war. But in the beginning, it started out with Bush, for instance, promising Americans that he wouldn't get involved in nation building in Afghanistan. And, they did to some degree under Bush, but, many former officials actually said that was the moment we could have had the most effect on Afghanistan in those early years when the Taliban was at bay, the time when Afghanistan needed the most help was in that period between 2001 and 2004. That's when we could have done the most good, but because we were distracted by Iraq and because the Bush administration didn't want to be seen as lavishing money on Afghanistan, we didn't spend enough or do it smartly in Afghanistan. But then when Obama came into office in 2009, things shifted. He, of course, had promised to get out of Iraq, and eventually he did, but he promised to fix the war in Afghanistan. So even though he also promised Americans that the United States would not get involved in nation building in Afghanistan, he actually turned on the taps with the funds. So we started spending billions and billions of dollars a year to build schools, build roads, clinics, build up the Afghan army. And frankly, we were flooding the country with more money than it could possibly absorb. And this led to all other complications such as corruption and projects that we couldn't track. And so we went from one extreme to the other, trying to build up Afghanistan, and neither approach worked.
So I do want to come back to the money and the corruption during the prosecution of the war during the Obama administration. But there was really no appetite for, or what you're saying is there's no appetite for spending that. If we had spent the money that became available in 2008 to 2010, back in say 2002 to 2006, we might have been in a different place. But maybe the context that you described of Afghanistan's decades of war and civil war and Soviet occupation, all that still would have been a huge challenge no matter what.
Yeah, no question it would have been a huge challenge. But part of the problem was really political, that when George Bush had run for office in 2000, when he first ran for the presidency against Al Gore, he was highly critical of the Clinton administration for what he derided as nation building in places like the Balkans or Somalia or Haiti. And so he kind of staked his turf, saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to let the US military get involved in these endless nation building campaigns. Now, of course, he didn't foresee what would happen in Afghanistan. And all of a sudden, the biggest nation building dilemma in the world lands on his lap. And so even though I think he and his administration knew that it was important to help Afghanistan, politically, he had already promised he wasn't going to do this. So this became a real difficult dance for him. By the time Obama came in office, I think Americans were already growing weary of war in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. I think they saw Afghanistan as a war worth fixing. But they didn't want to overspend either. We had just entered this really terrible recession. And so it was hard for Obama to justify spending billions and billions of dollars in Afghanistan when we had so many needs at home. So this political problem really hamstrung both of those presidents in terms of they couldn't really level with the American people what they were doing.
I want to go to a couple of a quote from 2006 when then Ambassador Ron Newman, who's a friend of the World Affairs Councils and now leads the American Academy of Diplomacy, conveyed in a classified cable a Taliban leader's pithy assessment that you, the Americans, have all the clocks, but we have all the time. And Ambassador Newman was alerting Washington quite regularly of the rise in violence and the resurgence of the Taliban, who had nearly been seemingly eliminated. And one of the things that struck me, one of the things that you point out is there was the visit of retired General Barry McCaffrey in mid-2006. He was a hero of the Gulf War and was asked by the US military to visit Afghanistan and Pakistan and make an independent assessment, which was never publicized. And what struck me was of many things that came out of his mission was the prediction that even in the best case scenario, it would be 14 years, in other words, 2020, before the Afghan security forces could operate without US help. Spot on. But what do you do when you receive expertise like that? Hide it?
Well, that's right. And this was, what did they do? They kind of, ignored it, or at least certainly didn't convey the seriousness of what was going on in Afghanistan to the public. And this is when the period of misleading the American public about what was going on really started to take root in 2006. The Taliban had been making a comeback. The number of suicide attacks and roadside bombings had escalated greatly from 2004 and 2005. But again, remember, the Bush administration was really preoccupied with all it could handle in Iraq, so it didn't want people to think it was losing the war in Afghanistan. That would look terrible politically if they're losing both of these wars. So in public, the message was they would deny that the Taliban was making a comeback. I'll give you one example. In September 2006, on the 5th anniversary of September 11th, the war commander at the time, Lieutenant General Carl Eikenberry, gave an interview to ABC News. And he starts off the interview by saying, "We're winning in Afghanistan," right? A very upbeat report of what was going on. Just a few days before that, Ambassador Newman, who you mentioned, who was the top diplomat in Kabul, had sent a classified diplomatic cable back to Washington, back to the Pentagon, also to General Eikenberry. And he starts off this cable with the words, "We are not winning in Afghanistan." So the complete opposite message in private as opposed to the public assessment. And we see this really start to deepen this gap, this complete difference between the public and private messaging during that period. And it only became more ingrained for the rest of the war.
It's understandable, I suppose, that junior officers and lower level diplomats are not going to risk their careers and speak up about what they see. But what do you say about three-star generals like Douglas Lute, who later became our ambassador to NATO at the North Atlantic Council, the political body there, and Michael Flynn, General Flynn, who also a three-star, had, back in those days, highly regarded analysts and commanders. Why don't they talk?
Well, this is a really good question, but this goes up and down the chain of command. If you're a two-star, three-star, four-star, and you say something that contradicts what the commander-in-chief is telling the public, you're not going to stay in uniform very long. But there is a difference between sort of withholding your true feelings, your true assessment of what's going on, and saying something that's just not true. I don't think any administration expects their generals to falsely say something in public that they just know doesn't carry any water. And yet during this period, and it wasn't just under Bush, it was also under Obama, you had general after general stand up at press conferences and in television interviews, and they would always say, "We're making progress, we're making progress. Yes, there maybe have been some setbacks or it's a challenging time, but we're turning the corner." And the one general who started to tell the truth about that things were going south was General David McKiernan. And he was the war commander in 2008 during the end of the Bush administration and then the start of when Obama was in office. And in 2008, he starts to come out and admits in some interviews to say, well, we're not winning in Afghanistan. He's not Pollyannish. He doesn't say we're going to lose, but he acknowledges for the first time that the war is not going in the right direction. And at that time, he had been asking for more forces and more resources. But within a year of him taking command, he gets fired by former Defense Secretary Robert Gates and also by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, Admiral Mike Mullen. And when Gates and Mullen held a press conference in May of 2009 to announce that McKiernan had been relieved, this was the first time a war commander, the top general in the field, had been relieved of command in a war since General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War. So it's a big, big step. This doesn't happen very often. but neither Gates nor Mullen could really explain why they had fired McKiernan. When they were asked by the Pentagon press corps, they kept saying, well, we just thought it was time for a change. We wanted some new thinking at the top, but they really ducked the question of what was going on or what prompted this extraordinary step. In interview documents we obtained for the Afghanistan papers, there were a number of officers in Afghanistan who had worked with McKiernan and said he confided to them that, you know, I think I did too good a job of telling the truth of how bad things were over here. So whether Gates and Mullen intended it or not, the message they sent to the rest of the force, to the rest of the Defense Department was, if you tell the truth that things aren't going well, you could lose your job, even if you're a 4-star. And so I think that was a lesson that the military learned early on, that, you know, if they spoke out or they were very frank in their assessment that things weren't going well, this could be the end of their career.
Thank you very much. We're talking with Craig Whitlock, investigative reporter at the Washington Post, about his new book published today, The Afghanistan Papers, A Secret History of the War. I'm going to go to the field and get their questions momentarily, but I want to talk just about the papers, the process, and the parallel with the Pentagon Papers, which were published 50 years ago this summer, back in June of '71, amid the Vietnam quagmire. To what extent do you see there being a real comparison in terms of how government operates, government meaning the military, the diplomatic corps, USAID, and our elected leaders in leveling with the public, and also from the perspective of freedom of the press and what you go through to acquire this information, which is so voluminous?
Well, thanks for that question. I think it's important to explain the similarities and differences between the Afghanistan papers and the Pentagon papers. There's some striking similarities. So just to remind people, the Pentagon papers was a secret study of the war in Vietnam that was commissioned by then Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. And this was a top secret study. You know, it was not ever meant to be made public. In fact, McNamara was so worried about it leaking out that he told the people working on it they couldn't interview anybody when they were making their assessment, that they could only draw on documents like diplomatic cables or memos or you know, force protection issues, things like this, that it all had to be done on paper. They couldn't talk to anybody. The Pentagon papers, of course, were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg to the New York Times and then the Washington Post and other news organizations. The Nixon administration tried to prevent the Times and the Post from publishing the full scope of the Pentagon papers. This went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the right of the press to go ahead and publish this, even though it was classified information, ruling that the government couldn't impose prior restraint on news organizations. This was a landmark First Amendment case. Now, the Afghanistan papers are the same in the sense that they, like the Pentagon papers, it also reveals that the US government wasn't telling the truth about what was going on in Afghanistan, just like they hadn't in Vietnam. The scope of the documents are different, however. This was a project being carried out by an obscure federal agency called the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, what was called a lessons learned project, where the Inspector General staff interviewed more than 400 people who had played a role in the war to find out what mistakes had been made so they could apply these lessons to the future. So the Afghanistan papers are really based all on interviews. These are notes and transcripts of interviews with more than 400 people. This was not classified material, but once I got wind of all these interviews that hadn't been made public, my argument was that this is public information, it's not classified. There is a real strong public interest in knowing what these people said about mistakes made in Afghanistan. The war was still going on at this point. So the long and short of it is the Washington Post had to file 2 Freedom of Information Act lawsuits against the government to compel it to release this documentation. And it took us 3 years, but we finally were able to pry all these papers loose. And we used those interviews and transcripts as the core of our original series called the Afghanistan Papers in December 2019, but they're also at the core of the book that was just published. So these really give us, in more human terms, greater insight, I think, than the Pentagon papers did. The Pentagon papers were kind of clinical, they were very dry, there were no interviews, there was no personal commentary. The interviews for the Afghanistan papers are full of people admitting just mistake after mistake, and they're kind of these blistering assessments of generals and diplomats admitting that they really didn't know what they were doing in Afghanistan.
People actually said, we don't know what we're doing. People who advised Obama, people who advised Donald Trump. You, well, maybe not Donald Trump so much, but although you, the Post, meaning you and your team, and it's an incredible effort in terms of production, not just your great journalism, but the photography and the graphics. For those of you who, and we have a lot of students who will be digging into this through our Academic World Quest program, the December 2019 publication and what followed is just exemplary journalism.
And Bill, I'm sorry if I could just, for your
Yeah.
viewers, we made a point, the Post editors decided, we had gone to such lengths to get those documents that we wanted to post them for everyone to see. So we did, we put them all on the internet on our website. We made them searchable by subject, by the name of the people's being interviewed. So we've left all that material up there because that is public information. And we felt that it was very important that people could read this for themselves. And then when they would read the articles, we would link to the actual document. So people could see this wasn't something that was coming from anonymous sources that was just getting made up. This all came from documentation from inside the government. And I think that really lent a certain credibility to it, that people could see this is where they're drawing their conclusions from. And it's been used a lot, quite a bit in research and by students, by academics and other folks, that I do think this is a historical trove of information that people can study for years to come.
Great. I want to open it up to questions from the field, and I'm seeing a comment by Kathleen Milan, if I'm pronouncing her surname correctly, who is a retired military officer who was at U.S. CENTCOM when General McCaffrey's report was delivered back in 2006. And she says that a lot of these issues didn't make it past, as you said, past a certain level in DOD. Staff officers highlighted concerns about mission creep, the need to depart. I think she means the country, raising concerns that the US would follow in Russia's footsteps. What about the role of the US intelligence community in this? You talk about the secret history of the war. Apart from military and diplomats, how accurate, how compelling was what our intelligence community was producing then?
Well, that's another great question. Now, again, there's only so much we know about that because by definition, the intelligence assessments are mostly classified. But we do know that throughout most of the war, particularly during the Obama years and Trump years, that the intelligence assessments of how the war was going from the CIA, NSA, Defense Intelligence Agency, from our spies and analysts, was always much more pessimistic than the public pronouncements coming from uniformed military leaders. In public, the generals in charge of the war would always give these upbeat assessments, status reports to Congress, and in interviews with the media, they would say, we're making progress, we're making progress. The Afghan army's doing great. Our strategy is working out very well. But once a year, you'd have the heads of the intelligence agencies would go up to Capitol Hill, testify before the Senate and the House about worldwide threats to the United States, and a portion of their testimony would deal with Afghanistan. And routinely they would give a much more negative assessment of what was going on, and they would say, the Afghan security forces are weak, they're not very strong, the Taliban's growing more powerful. But this message was really, because it only happened once a year, and most of the time they would talk in closed session, this was something that wasn't heard by the public nearly as much. There was one moment in 2013 when James Clapper, who was then the director of national intelligence, testified before Congress and about how things weren't going that great in Afghanistan, despite what the generals were saying. And he was asked by a senator, Director Clapper, why are your assessments at odds what we're hearing from the field commanders? And Clapper said, well, forgive me, but I served in Vietnam and I was the briefer for General Westmoreland there. And I learned a long time ago that the intelligence assessments aren't welcomed very much by the generals in charge, that they always see things through rose-colored glasses. So he made that clear, but again, the intelligence officials, it isn't their job to speak in public very much. So, the American people really didn't hear those pessimistic accounts. What they heard were the presidents and generals reassuring them, not just that they were making progress, but that they would win. Bush, Obama, and Trump all promised victory in Afghanistan. They promised to win, they promised to prevail. Now, some of that might be rhetoric, but as has become clear in recent weeks, that wasn't going to happen. That wasn't in the cards. And, they knew, according to their own assessments, that there was a high likelihood that the Taliban might take over someday.
Well, one British military leader said, we don't even know what winning looked like. And so, it's curious when you think of the assets at under the control of the Pentagon and the CIA and other branches of government that regularly engage in scenario planning, that they must have run certain scenarios of counterfactuals at the time, but we certainly do it in hindsight. So I want to share a few from our audience. Maria Zamet poses the question, among the many what if scenarios lately, what is your assessment of what if we had accepted a negotiated surrender with the Taliban in 2002?
Well, that's a really great question. And this is something you see again and again in the Afghanistan papers. There are people regretting that there wasn't an outreach done to the Taliban in 2002. At the time, there were some leaders of the Taliban who had expressed some willingness to enter into the new political system in Afghanistan, to acknowledge that there was a new government under Hamid Karzai, and they were essentially saying, okay, we want to come in from the cold and be a part of this new system. And I don't want to misrepresent. I think at the time politically that would have been very hard because America was still reeling from September 11th. It thought it had won that war. So it would have been hard to all of a sudden, negotiate with the Taliban. And Bush administration officials made very clear from the outset that they saw the Taliban as terrorists. They kind of lumped them in the same basket as Al-Qaeda. And Donald Rumsfeld in particular kept saying, we don't negotiate with terrorists. They can surrender or be killed. So he took a very hard line in 2001 and 2002, much to people's regret today. But even in later years, in 2004, after the first presidential elections in Afghanistan, there were actually free and fair elections where Hamid Karzai was elected president of Afghanistan. There was a real feeling of optimism at that point. The Taliban had tried to disrupt the elections, but were unsuccessful. And that would have been also a really good moment when the Taliban was at a low ebb to try and say, okay, give up the insurgency and come into the political system. Afghanistan had a history of this, of reconciling after wars among the different factions. But again, the United States and also President Karzai really weren't interested in that at that point because they thought they had the upper hand. They thought the Taliban had been vanquished, had been defeated for good. But this again was another classic and core misjudgment made by US officials where we really didn't understand Afghanistan that well. We thought the Taliban had been eliminated, but they were too much a part of the fabric of Afghan society. And it was one thing to eliminate Al-Qaeda, which is a limited number of foreign fighters, but the Taliban were a domestic force. This was a group that was part of Afghan society, and we just weren't going to get rid of them, and we were very short-sighted about that.
And they are here today in force, and we're going to be talking about what comes next. But another question, another what if, let's look at a few points of the preceding administrations. This is from Jack Siegel, a former diplomat. When President Obama was confronted with General McChrystal's assessment, Ambassador Eikenberry advised against the surge recommended by McChrystal and supported by Lieutenant General Lute. What difference would it have made if Obama had not authorized the surge? Which, by the way, I think his vice president was against too.
That's right. So, this is a classic hindsight question. What difference, what would the main answer is, what would the alternative have been? Biden and Lute and others were pushing for what they called a counterterrorism strategy, where they wouldn't send large numbers of troops. They would send some more, but they would really limit military operations to trying to find or prevent attacks from insurgents like Al-Qaeda or other groups, but that they weren't going to try and transform Afghan society or build up this giant Afghan army or an Afghan government that had the support of the people. Would that have worked in the long term? It certainly would have cost a lot less, both in terms of lives and money. I can't say that was a surefire strategic winner, but certainly Obama's strategy didn't pan out. And you mentioned McChrystal's advice. I mean, I was really shocked by some of the documents we obtained for the Afghanistan papers, in which people were assessing McChrystal's strategy review, where he wanted to send a lot more troops and adopt a full-blown counterinsurgency strategy. There was one interview with a former NATO official who said that McChrystal's strategy review, its first draft, didn't even mention Al-Qaeda. It just talked about the Taliban and Afghan government, and it was a 60 or 70-page document, didn't once mention Al-Qaeda. And of course, Al-Qaeda was the whole reason we went to war in Afghanistan. So some of the European allies said, you've got to mention Al-Qaeda in there somewhere, right? It has to be part of your strategy. So McChrystal put in a few references, but it was clearly an afterthought. But to me, that kind of summed up the problem. We never really came up with a strategy to articulate why we were there, what we were hoping to accomplish. And we lost sight of the original goal, which was just to deal with Al-Qaeda.
That's the original goal that became decimating the Taliban movement, which became denying terrorist groups a safe haven in Afghanistan, which became building and training Afghan security forces, which became helping a civilian government become legitimate and capable, and none of them today are achieved. Corruption had a lot to do with that. Our own domestic politics had a lot to do with that. Another factor is Pakistan, and we have a question from anonymous attendee. What is your assessment of Pakistan's role during the 20 years and how various administrations engaged with it?
Yeah, another good question. Clearly, Pakistan was playing a double game all along. They were saying they were the United States ally on counterterrorism, and they did help track down some Al-Qaeda figures, but they were playing a different game in Afghanistan while still maintaining support for the Taliban. And it's clear that US officials were very slow to recognize this, which again was a little surprising to me in doing my research, because as a journalist, we had been reporting this often during the Bush administration, these doubts about whether the Taliban was really helping or hindering the United States in Afghanistan. And yet I would see interviews with ambassadors and other senior officials saying, it didn't really occur to them that the Pakistanis were doing this until 2007 or 2008. I was very surprised by that. But I also mentioned General McChrystal's strategy review. There were other interviews which pointed out that McChrystal, in addition to not mentioning Al-Qaeda in the early drafts, he barely mentioned Pakistan. In fact, he said that, yes, Pakistan's a problem because it offers safe haven to Taliban fighters, and we have this cross-border problem with the insurgency. But he asserted in his strategy review that the war was still winnable in spite of that. He thought the Taliban could be defeated even though they had this safe harbor in Pakistan. I think, a lot of people would be surprised by that today, because most military analysts and other strategists would say, this was just a huge handicap throughout the war. The biggest reason we could never really keep the Taliban down is because they could keep going back into Pakistan, finding more fighters, more equipment, more money, and we couldn't operate there. So it was surprising to me that McChrystal didn't seem to understand that. But again, this goes a long way toward explaining the problem with the war. We never really dealt with the Pakistan problem or figure out what to do about it.
How do you assess the Trump administration's dealings with the war? Your expose came out in December 2019.
Well, that's a good question. I think people by then, during the Trump years, people had really tuned out what was going on in Afghanistan. They thought the war had kind of been over. They knew we still had troops there, but it wasn't getting much attention. And part of the reason was that both the Obama administration and Trump administration really cut off access to commanders and troops. It was very difficult for journalists to do embeds in Afghanistan or even to gain interviews with the generals. So there was this real deliberate attempt to minimize the amount of public attention being paid to the war, because at that point, public opinion had really grown against it. There was a lot of fatigue with the war and why we still had troops there. But I think it's probably will come as a surprise to most people that the air war under Trump really intensified, that we conducted more airstrikes in Afghanistan during the Trump years than we did during the last 4 years of Obama's term. In fact, the annual number of airstrikes under Trump was higher than any year under Obama. So even though we had fewer troops on the ground, the air wars were really devastating. And this was really kind of a blunt force attempt by Trump to kind of bludgeon the Taliban into submission, or at least make them weaker in hopes that they would come to the negotiating table. But it really didn't work at all. The Taliban kept getting stronger, and their hand kept getting fortified in negotiations. So we spent an enormous amount of money and killed an awful lot of people, including an awful lot of Afghan civilians during this air war that really got very little attention in the United States.
You mentioned tuning out. There was, I think it's a derivative, the Quincy Institute and others have acknowledged a report from, I think, a blogger that said, who has monitored the war for the past 20 years. And last year in 2020, the US television networks, the mainstream networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, carried just about single-digit minutes of coverage on Afghanistan's war. It's a different story today. Every network is leading with it and devoting countless hours to coverage, understandably so. But that attention span is really interesting. And I wonder, as a journalist yourself, obviously the newspapers and magazines and online journalists have covered it much more closely. What do you think can help the public understand better what's going on if we don't have adequate media coverage?
Well, that's a tough question, and you're right. It's a little complicated. I've seen references to that report about the television networks. I think part of it is they're talking about the evening news at 6 o'clock, yes. and it doesn't count cable shows that would cover the war. But there's no doubt the amount of coverage on television had really dwindled during the latter part of Obama's term in office and during the Trump years. Again, as I mentioned, part of this was because the US government was deliberately trying to make it hard to cover. So if you're a television network and you want to send a correspondent and crew to Afghanistan, you need some pictures of the commanders and an interview. And this was being choked off for them. So it doesn't mean they couldn't have still covered things. They could have and should have. Just like reporters with print organizations like the Washington Post maintained bureaus there and kept covering things pretty closely. But I think there was a real public fatigue with what was going on. It felt like things weren't changing. We kept hearing the same messages about how we were just there to advise and assist the Afghans. And, really, people didn't see any progress or change in the last several years. It's only when all of a sudden we see the Taliban sweep into Kabul, within elbow to elbow where US troops were, that this really shocked a lot of people. We didn't know that the Taliban had that kind of level of strength that could sweep through and take over the government. And it seemed like the Afghan government just melted before our eyes, which it kind of did. But I think people were shocked by this because this is the first time they had really seen pictures of it and seen just how desperate things had gotten in Afghanistan. People had really, again, tuned it out for the preceding decade, really, since Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011.
And certainly the human element of the story today carries great attention when you're talking about evacuees, Afghan refugees, the status of women has come up again and again in our questions. What do you see being the focus, both from the US government side and also from the media, on what happens next in Afghanistan? Are we going to build back some kind of diplomatic presence? Secretary Blinken says we're done with the military. We're beginning the diplomatic effort from here on. What's the meaning of that? And what's the likely support for ordinary Afghans?
Well, it's hard to be optimistic about how Afghan women and girls will be treated by the Taliban. I mean, they have a clear record and history of subjugating women, not wanting them to go out in public, not allowing them to gain educations or take jobs outside the home. And I don't think they're going to change very much. They may act in public for public consumption that they've moderated their views, but I'm very skeptical of that. And at this point, there's not a whole lot of leverage the United States has over issues like that. That said, I do think it'll be very interesting to see how the diplomatic ties between the United States and the Taliban will unfold in the coming weeks and months. On one hand, this was a group we had been fighting for years and years and years, but Blinken's right, we have some leverage over the Taliban in that Afghanistan as a country has been very dependent on USAID and donations from other countries around the world. And most of that money and aid has been frozen, at least for the moment. And there's a real risk of economic collapse in Afghanistan if that aid doesn't resume somehow. And the Taliban's very aware of this. So they crave diplomatic recognition by the United States and other countries so that this aid can flow in and it legitimizes their rule. So there is some leverage there. There's also, frankly, some common interests, believe it or not, between the Taliban and the United States when it comes to security issues. We all remember the terrorist attack, the suicide bombing at the airport in recent days that killed 13 US service members, that was carried out by Islamic State of Afghanistan and Pakistan, ISIS, we call them. And ISIS and the Taliban are sworn enemies. And in the past, the United States has actually sort of quietly helped the Taliban fight Islamic State. People may have noticed that there were news reports recently of the CIA director, Bill Burns, flew into Kabul recently and met with the Taliban leadership. And I was really struck by that. It didn't get a lot of attention, of course, but the fact that you have the CIA director flying into Kabul after the Taliban had taken over to hold direct talks with them, almost certainly he's talking with them to see if there are ways to cooperate in intelligence operations or counterterrorism missions against Islamic State and other jihadist groups. So there are some commonalities and some leverage there, and we'll just have to see how that plays out. It's one thing politically, however, it's going to be tough all of a sudden for the United States to recognize the Taliban after we've been fighting them for so long. So we'll just have to see how quickly that might unfold.
Talk about the military industrial complex and the conflicts of interest there that arise when you have a lot of money on the line to sell gear, a lot of which is remaining behind, to fight these wars and to influence policy via think tanks or public perceptions via pieces on war on terror or Islamophobia. How much should the American public be concerned about the influence of defense contractors in conflicts like Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's a legitimate concern a lot of people have. And looking back, that's sort of an obvious line of inquiry. To what degree did those conflicts of interest play in a role in extending the war as long as it did? That's kind of hard to measure, but it's always a really good idea to be skeptical and to ask if there's any connections or conflicts that should be disclosed. And frankly, in the media, we don't always do a good job of this. When you see people on television who are retired generals or retired US officials who are advocating one course of action, it's very rarely is it ever disclosed if they have ties to contractors or defense companies who of course have an interest in the warfare continuing. I think everybody needs to do a better job of making those connections clear, and that's something that members of the public are right to ask about. I'm not saying every retired general is going to make a profit if the war continues. I want to be careful about that, but there's nothing wrong with asking those questions, and both those people who do have those connections should disclose them, and reporters should be aware of that as well and ask those questions too.
Related to the public's appetite for, you talked about fatigue. This is from Hongda Jiang, who asks, to what extent the US public will become more skeptical of future war rhetoric coming out of Washington, given the obvious dishonesty that you've exposed over the years in Afghanistan? Or will the Afghan episode be largely forgotten by the masses the next time there's a rally around the flag incident or movement?
Yeah, the short answer is I don't know. People have short memories sometimes. I do think there's a real skepticism that sort of become deeply rooted nowadays. But I think there's a distinction here. People have always, I think most Americans are a little bit cynical about politicians and what they promise and say, but they draw a line between elected office holders or politicians or analysts and people in uniform. All the opinion polls have shown over the last 20 years that the US military is the most respected institution in the United States. So when generals say things in public, people tend to give that a lot of weight. There's certainly people don't expect that they're partisan. They tend to think that people in uniform are telling them the truth. I think the military in that regard, though, has suffered a real blow in recent years because people now remember how the generals kept telling them that they were making progress, they were going to win. And now they see that that wasn't true. And they read books like mine and other reports that cast real doubt on the veracity of people in uniform. So to me, that's a problem the military is really going to have to grapple with in the coming years. How do they get their credibility back? I think they've really been at risk of losing that credibility for a long time. And I think the way the war in Afghanistan ended, is a real setback for them in that regard. And they need to get that back. They're not politicians. They need to have that trust with the American people. And I think that's incumbent on them to earn that back.
Did any of the people that were interviewed by SIGAR, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, emerge with integrity or folks that you would consider a trusted analyst today?
Well, I think some of them do, yes. When you read the interviews, some of them are very frank and very forthright. And there's a difference between people who said, look, I want you to make my remarks public. This should be on the record. We need to have this reckoning. And two of them, I was just on a panel with at the Washington Post. One was Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who served as the top US diplomat in Afghanistan twice, both under Bush and Obama, and Lieutenant General Doug Lute, who was the war czar under both Bush and Obama. Now, I don't think they necessarily agree on everything about the war, but they both gave long interviews to the Inspector General with a lot of blistering criticism, but they both they said this should be made public. Still, I had to fight like heck in court to get their comments pried loose from the Inspector General. But, those gentlemen, I think they thought it was important that the remarks be made public. They're not backing away from them. So there were some people who were forthright, and I think that's important to note. At the same time, there were a lot of people who the last thing they wanted was the Washington Post to get its hands on what they said to the Inspector General, and we're hoping we'd lose our public records lawsuit because, in Washington, by and large, people don't like being seen as rocking the boat. They're worried about any damage to their career, and they just, they don't see any reward in speaking forthrightly in public, unfortunately.
We have a few minutes left, Craig, or maybe 1 minute left. I want to pose two questions to you. One is from Christine Scheckler, who is our leader at the San Diego World Affairs Council. She says USAID and its many implementing partners, NGOs mostly, have been deeply and intimately engaged in Afghanistan for 30 or more years. Many have tried to better inform policymakers of the realities on the ground and what options may make more sense. In your research, did you talk to old Afghan hands? And if so, what was their take or recommendation on that? Do you see a critical role for USAID and partner organizations in Afghanistan or the region?
Well, this is a real tragedy of the last 20 years. Is I think at its core, the United States really did try and help Afghanistan, whether it's service members in the field, whether it's aid workers, diplomats. I mean, the intention was pretty noble. It was to try and help the Afghan people, to try and build up a government there, to try and eliminate the risk of terrorism. So the intentions were right. And I think aid groups have a lot more experience working there. And yes, absolutely should have been listened to. But one thing we do see time and again in the documents from the Afghanistan papers was there was a real concern that USAID had been hollowed out in the 1990s, that by the time September 11th happened and all of a sudden there's this enormous challenge to rebuild Afghanistan, USAID really didn't, it contracted out most of its functions. It didn't have a standing capability to help rebuild a country like Afghanistan, and just at a time when it was needed the most. So that's a problem that I don't think has been fixed and will probably be faced again.
Sticking very quickly with SIGAR, which came out with its 11th report at the end of July or early August. I'm sure you've read it. I'm struck by their conclusions about, they list 7 principal reasons why this was such a fiasco. But here we have quoted in the conclusion, former National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley, now with the U.S. Institute of Peace, I believe, who said, "We just don't have a post-conflict stabilization model that works. Every time we have one of these things, it's a pickup game. I don't have confidence that if we did it again, we would do any better." Does this suggest to you that there's, go ahead.
I'm going to give you a bit of a sideways answer there. It's a remarkable quote, right? And people should know about that. And the irony here is the Inspector General waited till this summer to release that. The Post had to sue the Inspector General for Hadley's interview notes. Hadley gave that interview 5 or 6 years ago, and the Inspector General kept it under wraps until now. Now, the Post finally obtained his interview notes back in 2019, and we posted them online, but we had to fight like heck in court to get that public information. So, it's something that sticks in my craw. I think the Inspector General should have made this information public a long time ago. Its conclusions are pretty harsh, but why didn't they tell the American people this back 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago when it would have mattered more? Now they're kind of coming in at the end. And I think frankly, that's malpractice on the agency's part.
Andrew Bacevich, who is one of the leaders at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, has said more than what's going on now and how we left the chaos of the evacuation and maybe even the ignominy. Why did we go there in the first place? What did we actually do? Why did we stay so long? Craig Whitlock's book, The Afghanistan Papers, tells us a lot about those answers, those questions and his answers. But Bacevich goes further. He says, when we consider threats to our security, there's out there, but there's also here. Climate, environmental degradation, health and disease, domestic unrest are all capable of taking more lives than the Taliban ever could. What do you think about that?
I think that's a very legitimate point. And I think, again, we lost sight of things. The price we paid in Afghanistan in some ways was more than what we suffered on September 11th. And I think we don't necessarily compare the two. I mean, both were tragedies, but we've spent an enormous amount of money and lost many, many lives, both American lives and Afghan lives and Allied lives, fighting this war just to prevent another September 11th. And, yes, we haven't had another attack like that, but, my gosh, there had to have been more effective ways to prevent a repeat of 9/11 than what we did in Afghanistan. And there's no question there's a lot of domestic priorities that have gone unaddressed. But again, his question, why did we go there? Well, we know why we went there, but why did we stay is the whole other question that I think we need to really answer. It sounds like a simple question, but the answers are a lot more complex. And, this kind of thing can happen again. If there's another attack from overseas, there's going to be enormous pressure to respond to it. And, how do we do so in a more sensible manner? That's the thing that I think the country kind of needs to come to grips with now.
Craig Whitlock's timely book, and thank you for this conversation, came out today. It's The Afghanistan Papers, The Secret History of the War. Good luck to you. We'd be happy to facilitate engagements at World Affairs Councils around the country, including with any updates in the paperback version a year or so from now, Craig. So again, thank you for joining us, Craig. Good luck with all your programs. I'm sure we'll see you on the news tonight.